fellowship. What a problem all that fellowship is, isn't it? What a terrible thing. What do we do in fellowship? All right. All right, well, let's go ahead and just waiting for more to trickle in. It seems in summer we ought to call these the trickle days of summer. Everybody just kind of trickling in, you know? And so that kind of is what it is. And so as we continue on, remember last week we were looking a little bit more at Foye Wallace, and we had seen the kind of the hard scrabble way of life he grew up in, and so that really influenced how he went about things. And so what we see happening in this, as we're here in the 20th century, in the 20s and the 1930s, we see this transition that's been happening. And so it kind of becoming more pronounced as, and so what we're seeing is we're seeing that there are those that are viewing what's going on in culture and life and saying, hey, what's going on? And so there were those that were saying, you know, people are just getting soft. And the one guy we quoted, Wibble Wabble, and, you know, all the different things, and, you know, stumbling over themselves to come up with descriptions as to who could name more things that were wrong or the problems or things like that. And so and that became kind of a dominant way. And so those you know, the big debating was going to be very prominent in that time. We're going to talk more about this. And so there were those that were saying, hey, wait a minute, we've had enough of this. And we were talking about grace, how there were those that were speaking the gospel of grace much more than others were. And so this was creating some conflict. And so there was these calls to get tougher. And so as we ended up last time, we were looking at Hugo McCord. And so he was one who echoed with more precision Wallace's call for more militant preaching and writing. In other words, you know, Wallace's view is we got to double down and stick with it. And so there are those among us who believe in being soft and non-controversial and non-fighting. And so, you know, his view, along with many others, was the idea you got to fight. You got to stand. And so there was a lot of this, you know, angst that went on. But the old book tells us to fight the good fight and to put on the whole armor of God. And so they're taking the things, you know, in the Scripture and using that to, you know, well, armor. Well, what do you do with armor? You wear armor when you fight, and so we got to fight, and so on and so forth. And so he was one example of that. Guess it probably helps to turn it on. McCord practiced what he preached. He explained that when he attended a Church of Christ in Greenfield, Tennessee, he was shocked to hear them call on a Presbyterian preacher to lead in prayer. And McCord debated what to do and then decided to condemn it publicly right now. So he pointed out the heinousness of what had been done. And so this was in the service. And so within 3 minutes, half a dozen people left the church. And, meaning got them walked out. And though McCord assumed they were all Presbyterians, he later learned that they were all members of that congregation, because they were embarrassed at the actions that he had done. And so then he made this point: the church is softening when we get along with sect neighbors regardless of the cost. And so this was kind of, not everybody didn't do this and so on and so forth, but these kind of things happen. And maybe some of us have seen that before in those things. And you're right, it's certainly very awkward at best. And so, you know, and of course the thought is that those of other groups aren't Christians and we're the only Christians, is the thinking. Or that McCord's going by, because we're following truth, because we study our Bibles and all this other stuff. And so that kind of feeds into that understanding. And so just And again, we kind of understand this. We brought up this way, and so interesting. So so McCord especially condemned in this regard R.O. Bowles' Word and Work. That was a publication that was a premillennial position on things that expounded grace. But then we also saw that there were those like Brewer, G.C. Brewer, and some others that were promoting grace, but not holding to those premillennial kind of views that we talked at last week. And so his complaint here about the Word and the Work and those that were preaching the grace is that they don't mention the names of those it attacks. And the Truth Seeker published at Harding, which he determined to be sweet-spirited, never pugnacious. On the other hand, he praised the firm foundation, the gospel advocate, the Christian leader, and the Christian worker, which he said are not hesitant in calling the names of denominations and uprooting their doctrines. In other words, what he's complaining about is that, these guys from Word and Work, they're talking about some of these concerns, and yet they're not naming names. And he wants them to name names and to go after it. And so he's holding up those publications that were going to name names. This person is saying this, and this person is saying that. And so really digging down, and that's that mentality. Similarly, he claimed that Harding and Lipscomb College, on one hand, with Freed Hardeman, which was positively outspoken. And so he contrasted such preachers as E.G. Igems, I think it's Igems. He was the president, I think, of Lipscomb at one time, who will call a Methodist preacher at New Hope brother on one hand, and he contrasted that with N.B. Hardeman, who is one of our main preachers, and E.R. Harper, whose preaching draws the line between truth and error and calls the names of errorists on the other. In other words, he's wanting this hard-charging, call-them-out attitude. So one finds in the Bible Banner, which was the publication that Foy Wallace had, in the late 30s, evidence of a serious divide within our fellowship. Wallace and his followers rose in opposition to those who sought to move the Church of Christ more into the mainstream of American life and culture. Wallace and his followers grew increasingly shrill regarding those they viewed as modernizers. Those gentler spirits sought to undermine Wallace's work to temper Churches of Christ with a measure of grace and render us less odious in the eyes of our neighbors. And so there were those that saying, hey, this hard charging, attacking everything and everybody, that's not the way to go. And so we see this conflict of how you go about things. Now, when we started early in January, we talked about fundamentalism, and we were talking about that battle with modernism. And so we tried to explore that, maybe way too much for most people's taste. But what was going on and this pushback against all these changes in culture and these many things that were questioning what for many people have been very, very foundational. And so it's this change. And you know what? Every generation or several generations, you have that. How many of us think, well, it wasn't that way when I grew up, or that isn't how I was taught? That kind of reflects that impulse that we all have and experience, and so they are certainly doing that here. And remember, there was massive changes in society, in culture, in technology that was going on from after the Civil War and then here into the 20th century. And I mean, think of what we've seen in our lifetimes. Think of what we've seen and how we've adapted or not adapted. Yes. Mm-hmm. Sure.
Have you made the point at some time that almost every denomination has gone through this process?
Yes.
Because
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, I'm just so ashamed. I'm so ashamed.
Yeah.
And Gary finally said to me, after the marriage, Christiana, everybody's done this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we do need to stand responsible for our history. I'm not
Yeah.
saying that. But we're not the only ones.
Correct. No, I hope I've said that many times, that we're kind of detailing ours because this is who we are, but we could go through any groups, and we would find similar types of conflicts and change, and I think that's really important that we realize that, as we've said multiple times, that because we think that this is something odd or strange or wrong, or how did it change, or this isn't what they did in the first century. Well, we're not the first century. I mean, in that sense. And so, were you waving your hand, huh? Oh, okay. Now, throughout the history of our fellowship, there were few who conceived of unmerited grace in the radical, uncompromising fashion that R.H. Bull and K.C. Mosier had. There were some, especially in Tennessee and Arkansas, who carried the banner of grace more successfully than Mosier. Remember, Mosier got a lot of pushback. He was from Texas. And so this was a kind of a strange thing that he was preaching generally from what people were accustomed to. And so he had a hard time with that. But there were those who carried it more successfully because of maybe their force of personality and their adherence to orthodoxy on other critical points. In other words, their big thing was on the grace. And as we've tried to say, we like to look at things as either all this or it's all that, so we can simplify it in our own minds. But rarely is it that. And so while someone may hold something over here, they might hold to something else over here. And so it isn't all or nothing. And I think that's really important we realize that in all kinds of things. And so we're going to see some different things here. Standing in the mainstream, but dissenting from the legalism the mainstream often fostered, these people typically refused either to support or condemn R.H. Bull and his premillennial movement. On the other hand, they did take a stand in outright opposition to the tactics that 4E Wallace was using of go out and crush them. And so might say they celebrated the doctrine of grace that downplayed the premillennial end times thinking that underpinned it. Okay, in other words, remember what we've been seeing is what Lipscomb thought and what Stone thought, that remember, the world is not my home. Don't get involved in all these things. God is going to come and destroy all this. You better focus on who we are as Christians in this world and have nothing to do with a lot of that other stuff. Well, that thinking that underpinned that understanding of grace and other things we've seen has been going away. And isn't going to become the main, and isn't the main position or the underpinning. And yet we're still going to have this understanding of grace where those preaching that aren't holding to that foundation that once held it up, so to speak. Significantly, these people not only rejected premillennialism, but typically abandoned the apocalyptic outlook that had driven the premillennial sentiment for over 100 years. They were thus prepared to make their peace with the surrounding culture in ways that might have shocked Barton Stone or David Lipscomb. So we see this transition. Now, I always keep reminding us, remember, we're way on this side of that. And so some of these things we might say, what's the big deal? Because we're comfortable with that. And I don't mean that as a good or a bad, it's just so. And so, but then that was some major upheaval. And so there were those who viewed that fighting against all that, because the most important thing was keep it as we've had it or understood or told ourselves it was, and defending that, and so there can't be anything different or change. Typical of this grace-oriented tradition was G.C. Brewer, Grover Cleveland. Wonder who he was named for. And he spent most of his life in Tennessee and northern Alabama. And there, as a boy, came under the influence of T.B. Larimore. And we've mentioned his name, but haven't spent a lot of time with him. One of the truly generous and kind-spirited preachers of the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, in your bibliography, if y'all remember that or even have it, there was a book in there called The Blue Hole, an elegy for Churches of Christ, and it came out a year or two ago. Well, Larimore is one of the central figures, and in that book, he's kind of describing this transition that took place, and it kind of ends with the death of Larimore in the late 20s, and how Wallace kind of rose to prominence in that, and that they were very different. One of the things, Larimore's a really interesting guy. He was, as a teenager, he was a scout in the Confederacy. He wasn't in the Army, but he was a scout. Oh, he's in Alabama. And he got captured by Union troops, and they just, scared him to death and made him promise that he wouldn't be involved in the conflict, and he wasn't after that. And so anyhow, so he became a preacher. He was known for having a preaching school in a place called Mars Hill, obviously named for, in the Bible from they're in, I think, Greece. Is that Greece? Marcel? Athens? And but anyhow, and he was very influential in teaching people. Well, one thing that he was known for, even though, he wasn't for, instrumental music or these other things, he wouldn't put down and go against and preach against those that were. And so there was people that hammered after him because he refused to do that. Even though he didn't agree with that, he was being gracious. And just a fascinating story on who he was. But anyhow, so he influenced Brewer. And Brewer also attended the National Bible School, which of course we said that's where Harding was, and Lipscomb had started that, now Lipscomb. And absorbed much of that spirit and understanding, which was that apocalyptical outlook. And to the extent that shortly before his death in 1956, he recalled, "I have never even voted in my life." Okay, so he held on to some of those things. But it's also true that he largely jettisoned the apocalyptic framework of his forebears in his efforts. And so just like anything, you can't pigeonhole somebody into all of this or that because they hold on to some things. Beginning in the 1930s, he would engineer a strongly patriotic, anti-communist movement among Churches of Christ. And we saw that was when we were looking at Harding and what was going on there with the president that was down there, and because of his experiences in China. And of course, we're not unfamiliar with this, that, growing up, when some of you did, and us, obviously a little later, that, communism was, the anti-Christian, the great, Satan, so on and so forth. And not that didn't have some validity. I'm not trying to say that. But this blending of that understanding on those things and Christianity started coming together, and kind of the equating of that. And so the Christian message was, if hey, you should be thinking about this on this subject, and so on and so forth. And the idea of patriotic of America as being the same, and we understand that. We've grown up with that. We believe in that, or at least have believed in that, and that's changing some, as we've talked about. People feel a little less that way now because of what we've seen play out And so people are kind of questioning some of that now. However right or wrong that is, that's certainly happening. But it does not alter the fact that Brewer spoke regularly of unmerited favor and challenged what he saw as a legalistic outlook among his people. When Casey Moser's book, The Way of Salvation, appeared in 1932, Brewer strongly endorsed it and criticized those who had turned the gospel into a legal system. And we mentioned that a couple weeks ago. In showing that a man can and must obey God in order to be saved, some of us have run to the extreme of making salvation dependent on works. Some have been wont to show that there is a human side and a divine side of salvation, and in doing so, they have made the human side coordinate with the divine. Worse, in the minds of some, the divine has been completely ruled out, and salvation has been made a matter of human achievement, except the plan, that plan of salvation, which was divinely given. Okay, and so we talked about this the last few weeks. That what is that emphasis? Now, I know that I shared. We could all share our stories on where we're at or where we've been and so on and so forth. But I know that in coming to Christ, and it's not trying to say if somebody understood these things they couldn't have come to Christ. I'm not saying that at all. But this emphasis, I remember as a young man, I became a Christian in a college ministry, so I wasn't a little kid, okay? And so as we were taught about Christ and so on and so forth, but there was also that emphasis that what was really important, that you understood the right things in the right ways. And it wasn't just about how we're forgiven. It was, you should also think this and this and this about this and this and that. And so it was the idea that almost, not necessarily directly said, but almost implied, that you got to believe the right things. Now, how long that list was depended on who you talked to. And for some, the list was quite extensive. And for some today still is. What do you believe on this and this and that? And if you don't believe that, I remember to my shame, and I've apologized and talked to my friend about it. I was at the time when we lived in South Carolina, working with a church down there. I had just finished reading Jim McGuigan's commentary on Revelation. And of course, once I read that, I knew everything about Revelation. And so, I was an expert on that, and the view that was presented in there was a view that we typically have in our fellowship of that, what they call the preterist, the historical view, not the premillennial and the end times of Hal Lindsey and all that. And I was so convinced that one needs to understand it that way, that I was talking to my best friend growing up, who was a strong, committed Christian, not in our fellowship, but very much so, and that if you don't understand it this way on Revelation, you might be in danger. And it's like, I look now, I go, how could I have ever said that? But I did. One might think it's more plausible in some other areas, but Revelation, the most challenging and misunderstood or difficult to understand book for our way of thinking. But anyhow, so he's challenging this idea. And so, as we said the other day, are we preaching the man or the plan? How are we saved? Are we saved by a plan or by a person? Is basically what the emphasis is getting down to. And so this is what's happening then. Brewer maintained that such teaching flatly perverts the gospel of God. Further, in the context of efforts to exclude R.H. Bull and his people from fellowship in the Churches of Christ, which Wallace and others were advocating. Brewer suggested that if anyone among Churches of Christ should be marked and voided, it should be the legalist who undermines the gospel. Concerning Mosher's book, Brewer ended by saying that if there is a conclusion in it from which I differ, I do not now recall it. And so remember, when Mosher's book came out, it created a big stir, or at least a little bit after it came out, because it was challenging what had been our normal orthodoxy in how things were preached and taught. And so this emphasis on unmerited favor continued to characterize Brewer's thinking and teaching. In 1945, he scolded those among Churches of Christ who have faith in faith, faith in repentance, faith in confession, and faith in baptism. Such emphasis on a plan, he argued, is to build according to a blueprint, and if you meet the specifications, your building will be approved by the great inspector. Such a notion is all wrong. We're saved by a person and not by a ceremony or a plan. And so that's the gist of what's going on. And we're not unfamiliar with this understanding. And again, I'm not trying to say that was all terrible and awful and everything, but that's what's fueling the changes here. And so that emphasis on Christ, because we know the difficulties there's been in that approach, meaning of all these things. You know, how often have we heard that everybody should be unified, just like we are? Well, wait, we're not as unified as you think. And so you see that. So some raise the question, maybe there's something wrong with the thinking, you know, or how one understands or looks at some of these things, and maybe there's a better way. And so that's what's happening. Brewer refused for many years to condemn R.H. Bull, even though he rejected Bull's premillennial outlook. Brewer knew full well that Bull's premillennial eschatology was but a reflection of a deeper theological commitment to unmerited favor or grace. In other words, grace is how he realized that Bull comes to that other understanding, even though he, Brewer, wasn't embracing or coming to those things. They had that foundation of grace. Brewer himself, Brewer felt that if he received God's grace, he should in turn extend that grace to others in spite of disagreements. And of course, why was disagreements a problem? Because there was a thought that there is truth, and you've got to believe the right things, and if you don't believe the right things, you're in an iffy position. And so that's what's being challenged here. And on a low level, we can think that can kind of make sense, but as you really start thinking deeper about it, more and more you go, are we really right on everything? How many times have we changed our mind in our life about something as we grew in understanding and so on and so forth? And so does that mean we're saved now and weren't saved then? You know, and it could just get in all kinds of questions. So that's a lot of deep theology, sorry. Consequently, as early as 1925, Brewer suggested that the premillennial issue was not worth discussing. He's saying we're wasting our time even dealing with this. And yet this was the issue that was raging in our fellowship, demanding that people take positions on it. And if you didn't take a position on it, you were chewed out and so on and so forth. And there was others that, yeah. And so then they felt, well, if that's how we should respond, then that's how I should respond. And so it just kind of kept going and kind of became what people normally saw and expected. Again, he objected in 1932 when Wallace was then the editor of the Gospel Advocate for just a few years. And he sought to charge Bull and his people with heresy, calling out people by names. Again, in 1933, he objected when Wallace prepared to debate Charles Neal on the issue of premillennialism, and I do not know who Charles Neal is, but obviously a prominent figure back then. But in 1934, Brewer laid all the cards on the table. Wallace had been scheduled to speak at Abilene Christian College lectureship that year, but canceled his engagement at the last minute. So what do you got to do? You got to fill in. And so what do? You get another big name. And so the college secured Brewer as a replacement. And he used the occasion to kind of criticize Wallace for his attack on Bull and the premillennial wing and causing all this stuff to go on and to urge a greater spirit of tolerance among churches of Christ. His criticisms of Wallace were sufficiently strong, or so sufficiently strong, that the editors of the annual lectureship book for 1934 edited the statements. And so, just so we know, is that after these big lectureships, they would print books, and so that it could be distributed further, and so people that weren't there, or if you were there, so you could go back and see or reread and so on, study the different messages that were given, and that was very common practice. And so they replaced them with more generic, though still quite pointed remarks. H.P. Showalter, editor of the Firm Foundation, provided readers with his own summary of Brewer's speech, which he had heard. According to Showalter, Brewer dismissed the Bull issue as lacking sufficient significance to justify division it had occasioned. Brewer claimed that Bull and his people were pure-minded, with a strong faith and a deep reverence for the Word of God, and added that Bull had entered his own life, meaning Brewer's, at a crucial period, and he believed had been the actual means of his salvation. And so Brewer, coming to faith, was influenced by the grace that Bull had taught. Brewer noted that he and Wallace differed widely on Bullism and suggested that the preachers who push debates on inconsequential issues often do so to distinguish themselves. In other words, to make themselves more prominent. I've mentioned several times that, Carl Ketcherside in his autobiography, describes it as personalities, and people who are trying to force their opinions on everybody else. And so that's kind of the same idea. And so Brewer's challenging that. Though Wallace's name does not appear in the text of Brewer's lecture that appeared in the official volume, Brewer's meaning was nonetheless unmistakably there. And so while he didn't mention Wallace, everybody knew he was talking about Wallace and those that were promoting that. The divisions that exist in local congregations or in any particular sections of the country, whatever may be the ostensible cause, are caused by carnality. In other words, these divisions are by sin. Those who are involved in a division always claim that some vital point is in question. They strive to justify the condition that exists by citing some doctrinal disloyalty or some unfaithfulness to the Word of God. Frequently, however, it is only our opinion or our judgment that has been discarded and not the Word of God. And so he's saying at the root of all this is pushing opinions, and they're making the case that if you don't agree with my opinion, something's wrong with you. And that that's disregarding the Word of God, rather than I just don't agree with you. And so interesting. And, we could probably all think in our own experiences and lives of situations that have been like that. That, it used to be in the past, people would read the papers, and I remember people would ask, hey, what is your position on this? What is your position on that? And then, you felt the tension of if you didn't come up with the right answer, you might get in trouble, if you didn't agree with it. And so this is what's happened. And this was very common. This was the way things were. And this still happens. I don't believe with the frequency at all. No, it is. There are still those that hold strongly to that. Were you raising your hand? Just waving? So Brewer continued. this is kind of interesting, this metaphor he uses. Our efforts sometimes are similar to the solicitous servant who jealously guarded his master's slumbers. The master had given orders to the servant not to allow him to be disturbed. But he was awakened by a bright flash and a sudden roar in the room which almost deafened him. In great excitement, he inquired of the servant what this meant. And the servant was standing there with a smoking revolver in his hand and said there was a mouse gnawing paper in the corner of the room, and he feared that he would disturb the master, and therefore he shot it. Brethren, let us quit shooting mice and therefore stop people to the extent of heart failure and death. And so, I think we understand the meaning of what this is. That, making because someone thinks differently on something just like the most important thing in the world. And it's not. And so this is what's going on in the struggles. When Wallace read the report in the firm foundation, he could hardly believe his eyes. He complained that the injury to the cause of truth could not have been greater had R.H. Bull appeared on the program in person. He took Brewer's speech as an attack on all the faithful preachers who are opposing this new party in the church, and as an effort to break the influence of the gospel advocates' opposition to this new party. Though Brewer would later become more openly critical of Bull's premillennial position, the relation between Brewer and Wallace was never the same. And so you just see this. I just can't help in all this to think of in James, where he writes, hey, aren't all these things, these passions within you that are, causing so much of this? Now, I'm not saying there's maybe never a time when that needs to be so, but certainly not nearly as many times as exhibited. And so the question is, was this as spiritual as we think, or was this more our worldly self in framing and demanding that? Christ said to be gracious and to bear with one another and to love one another and to forgive as Christ forgave us, and so on and so forth, that we're all familiar with. But a lot of times we can get caught up in this and we forget all that. Very easy to do. It doesn't take a lot of work to forget all that. And I unfortunately speak from personal experience. And so, interesting. In seeking to trace the evolution of the churches of Christ from that more exclusive outlook to a denomination, one cannot afford to ignore the importance of those who opposed premillennialism but embraced the heritage of grace. Those who sought in the 1930s to blunt the sectarian spirit and to move churches of Christ in the direction of progress, modernization, and really denominational status, that means at peace with the culture as we've defined it, typically stood squarely in that tradition. One has to appreciate the essential irony associated with the grace tradition. Who could have imagined that people with theological roots reaching so deeply into the soil of our sectarian, apocalyptic, countercultural tradition of Stone and Lipscomb would have provided the principal impetus for moving our fellowship from a more sectarian to denominational posture, and yet that thinking did. As the pounding waves of modernization slowly ate away the apocalyptic perspective of the Stone Lipscomb tradition and the principles of pacifism and refusal to participate in politics slowly washed out to sea, the theological moorings or the foundation of the grace tradition also underwent a radical transformation. Even among the proponents of the grace tradition, the apocalyptic perspective declined. There remained among them a strong doctrine of grace, but it was a doctrine of grace largely estranged from that sense of divine judgment that we talked about on the common culture. Okay, and so what held up that understanding is now dissipated. And so, but holding on to grace. Thus, in the early 20th century, heirs of the Stone-Campbell-Lipscomb tradition, already anxious to accommodate churches of Christ to the best of mainstream American culture, came into possession of a theological tool that would facilitate that accommodation, a doctrine of grace cut loose from that apocalyptic foundation. Scattered representatives of the grace tradition increasingly focus their energies on positive, constructive teaching that in many cases differ little from the moral values of the surrounding culture and transform grace into a kind and gentle spirit. And we're going to look a lot in detail with that next. In this way, they nudge churches of Christ further down the road of cultural adaptation and respectability. In other words, it's this change. So instead of this separate, this isolated kind of view of things, we're kind of becoming part of the main and the big part. And so that's an appropriate place to stop. And so next time we're gonna begin exploring this real transition from that primitive outlook to what we call modernization. And this is where we're going to really start connecting it to our own lives, because some here were living that, whether aware of it or not, when this was going on at the time, and it just helps explain a lot. So thank you very much. I know